Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to episode 186 of the Art of Procurement podcast, which is powered by SIG. And today I'm joined on the show by Shawn Burton. So Shawn is General Counsel of Business and General Aviation and Integrated Systems at GE Aviation. Shawn was connected to me via a former Art of Procurement guest, Nick Seiersen, and he's recently published an article in the Harvard Business Review on the virtues of plain language contracting. And while we did discuss plain language contracting, we also talked about the change and disruption underway in the legal profession, which I thought was a great way to be able to better understand and empathize with our peers in legal. The actual main focus of our conversation was a homegrown platform that GE Aviation has built that allows them to be far more strategic in their contract negotiations. And I'm not going to give away all the details now, but the intent of that tool and platform is to be able to assign a monetary value, either on the downside or the upside, of every clause within a contract so that the team can then quickly identify which clauses to negotiate on, and which would take longer to negotiate than the actual value of coming to a more favorable term and agreement with a prospective business partner. So with all that being said, let's go straight into the interview. And I started by asking Shawn if he could just share a little bit more about his background.
Yeah, sure. So I as I joke with a lot of my colleagues, I am a reformed labor and employment lawyer. Right. I spent the first 9 years of my legal career as a labor and employment attorney. Mm-hmm. 3 of those years were in a large regional firm. I was located in Cincinnati. And then back in 2007, I transitioned to GE Aviation and practiced labor and employment law within GE Aviation for a little over 5 years. And I was certain, Phil, that I was going to be a labor and employment lifer.
Right.
It was really a little doubt in my mind when I was younger. Loved my clients. The law was challenging. You know, the issues you face as a labor and employment lawyer, really interesting. And then in late 2011, I was attending a GE leadership training course in New York, and the final assignment that we were given was to find a quiet place on campus and go think about your career.
Right.
No other instructions were given. And, you know, after I did the proverbial eye roll, I went and found my quiet place, and like a good GE soldier, I took the assignment to heart, and I'm glad I did. So I spent a couple of hours alone just kind of thinking through what is it that really energizes me, what brings me real happiness, you know, the kind of happiness you can't wait to do it again tomorrow. Right. And I came up with 2 things. One was just being challenged. You know, for me, when I look back on when I look back on my career, what I got energized the most by was just kind of, you know, the challenge. Mm-hmm. Again, harder the better for me. The second thing was, you know, I got jazzed up by making a difference.
Yeah.
In other words, moving the needle in a truly meaningful way. And I was making a difference in my labor and employment role, but what I was finding was that the labor and employment role, I had been doing it for almost 10 years, and I was looking for something new. I was looking for a new challenge. So I raised my hand back in early 2012 and asked if there'd be an opportunity for me to move from a specialist labor and employment role into a more generalist general counsel role, and I was lucky enough in 2013 to be selected for a general counsel job covering one of the businesses within GE Aviation, specifically the avionics and digital business. And then in 2016, about 3 years later, another lucky opportunity came up. I was asked to take on a larger business, still within aviation, and today I'm the general counsel for the General Aviation and Integrated Systems business, a real mouthful. Yes, that's a little bit about me.
Just we've talked a little bit off mic on a couple of occasions, and what I love is, you share some of the passion that I share for how we can perhaps help evolve our professions and really take advantage of opportunities that are ahead of each other, as opposed to kind of remaining or retaining the status quo. And I'd love for you just to share a little bit of that with listeners in terms of your thoughts, both on, and I think this is important for procurement folks to hear, so they can have some empathy with their legal partners and some of the challenges they face, but then also how you're thinking about how can we drive disruption in this space.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I do actually spend a lot of time thinking about. Let me start here, Phil. I would say, from my perspective, lawyers in the legal profession in general have a sterling reputation for being great problem solvers. Mm-hmm. And I think the reputation is well deserved. You throw us the hardest problem, and we'll create a solution.
Yeah.
We can, with that issue, we're fantastic at doing what I call creativity in a box. And I think we have a reputation for that, and we do it pretty well. What I don't think we have a reputation for is being innovative and disruptive. Mm-hmm. And so let me kind of clarify what I mean by innovative and disruptive. I see a difference between, on the one hand, being a problem solver, and then on the other hand, being a paradigm shifter. Creativity in a box versus reimagining kind of the way that we deliver our services. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I use for the TV and movie buffs out there, I try to compare problem solver and innovation and disruption to MacGyver and Dr. Emmett Brown from Back to the Future. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about innovation and disruption, that's what I'm talking about, the truly transformative stuff. Yeah. We don't have a sterling reputation for that. And I think, there's pockets of innovation and disruption. I've seen it myself. I see it in GE Aviation. I know we're going to talk a little bit about it. And I certainly haven't done a far-reaching investigation into, what type of innovation disruption is going on. But I'm confident there are pockets of it. Yeah. But from where I sit, it's not that is innovation disruption. It's not a core competency of ours. We are domain experts. We are sage advisors. Pick up any job description for a lawyer or a general counsel, and I'll guarantee you nowhere on there will you find the words mad scientist. Right. It's just not an expectation that we have. And I, my this is what we've talked a little bit about, off mic, is I think there's a real opportunity here. I think we need a change and a culture shift. Moving towards a place where imagination, creativity, and the ability to disrupt is kind of core to our mission. It is what it becomes expected of us. It is what differentiates the good lawyers from the great lawyers. And I think, if we do that, I think that it will pay dividends. And, I can speak for GE Aviation. We have the GE Aviation legal leadership team. We spent a lot of time with this, and it's paying dividends. We've identified a number of initiatives and driven a number of initiatives that are truly innovative and disruptive and are changing significantly the way we deliver our services.
So I think there's so many parallels between procurements, when I think about where we are as a profession as well. I'm actually love to deep dive into some of those practices in a moment, but I'm curious, as you think about the shift that you've taken, in your thinking, and also what you're trying to do in terms of encouraging others within the legal profession to go on that journey with you. Do you think of this as being it's a nice to have, or whether it's existential for the future of your profession?
Great question. Another great question. So I would say, I think today, it's and historically, it's been a nice to have. Mm-hmm. But I see it going into the future as a professional imperative. Yeah. As this culture shift happens, again, it's going to become core to our mission, and the legal leaders who are good at it will differentiate themselves. Mm-hmm. The ones who are not, won't. I see it as a real legal imperative. I think our clients are going to will come to expect it from us. And once the client, i.e. the customer, begins to expect it, there's really no turning back.
Yeah. And I know this is more of a legal question again for listeners from a procurement perspective, but I'm going in a certain place, so bear with me. Do you think that technology is impacting legal in a way that will ultimately automate a lot of the things that are human-based tasks right now? So by not going on this journey actually runs the risk of what you know of your job today not actually existing tomorrow, and tomorrow obviously being some arbitrary point in the future, but that journey is taking place.
Yeah. So I get this question all the time, particularly in connection with one of the initiatives that we're pushing in GE Aviation, which we can talk about in a minute. But I get this question a lot. I get it from my team. In fact, I just blogged about this internally a couple weeks back. Because I think we are moving to a place where data analytics, software, automated tools will make us better, better at our jobs. But what I've made clear to my team and what I believe in my heart of heart is that technology can never replace judgment and experience.
Yeah.
Instead, technology, in my mind, enhances judgment and experience. And so there will always be a place for that sage advisor. The difference will be, the sage advisor will be able to take advantage of and leverage the technologies that are out there to be more effective in the delivery of their service and their advice.
Yeah, it's a question that we often have in the procurement profession as well. I think it mirrors a similar answer, and it's so important to change mindset to think about the art of the possible. With access to either being able to move quicker, smarter, having more data, what can we do with that? What's the greater value we can add, as opposed to fearing that parts of our roles are going to get taken away, but it's actually parts of our roles that we don't really want to do today because they're not entirely interesting parts of our jobs. So take this as an opportunity to figure out how we can do more and how we can ultimately create more value and have more interesting jobs.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. So I want to deep dive into a little bit of what you're doing at GE Aviation and this is really relevant for procurement because it's related to contracting. And, I think there's such a close relationship between legal groups and procurement folks when it comes to negotiating, obviously, and negotiating contracts. And I watched a Facebook Live webinar that you hosted. I think it was a couple of months ago, and I'm actually going to link up to it in the show notes for the podcast today, that started to talk about some of these initiatives. But it started off with this term that you used called brilliant contracting. I just wondered if you could share what brilliant contracting means to you. Yeah,
it's a phrase that we've kind of coined internally at GE Aviation, and really it's a phrase that describes two specific tools, both contracting tools. The first one is what we call contract monetization, and the second is plain language contracting. Together, we believe it'll make contracting significantly better, and thus the term brilliant contracting.
Right. What was the challenge or the solution that where you even thought, hey, we need to do something a little bit differently? Let's try and put our heads together to see if there's a different way that we can approach contracting.
Yeah. Well, and I talk about this a lot on the Facebook Live event, so I won't be redundant, but I had in 2013, shortly after transitioning from my labor and employment role, I had what I've called my flux capacitor moment. Again, for all you movie buffs out there, that's a reference to Back to the Future. It was my eureka kind of moment.
Yeah.
And I'll share a little bit about the story because I think it helps kind of set the stage for understanding contract monetization. I had just transitioned. I was about 9 months into my general counsel role, and I was tasked for the first time with providing a risk analysis of a contract, a customer contract, and the analysis was being delivered to the vice president of my business. And part of my job was to identify for him the terms that were risky in the deal, and then providing him with recommendations on how to mitigate the risks associated with each one of those terms. And so, I spent a lot of time prepared at that time. And by the time the meeting rolled around, I was confident, prepared. I had a perfectly designed PowerPoint slide, and it had 10 risky terms. So I had extracted 10 of what I considered the riskiest terms from a couple 100-page customer contract. In the slide also, each one of the risky terms was accompanied by a recommended revision that I believed would mitigate the risk of that term. So I delivered the presentation. I walked him through kind of methodically each one of the terms, each one of the recommendations. It takes me about 20 minutes, really no interruptions. I conclude my presentation by saying, "Are there any questions?" And the room, in addition to having our vice president there, it was chock full of business leaders. Big conference room, seats are packed. I conclude with any questions, and for a moment I thought, great, no questions. And I was wrong. So the vice president, who was a super great guy, super smart, really nice leader, he asked in the kindest way possible, he said, "Listen, John, I get it. I understand everything you presented to me, but I need to understand which terms really matter." And, my reaction was, well, they all matter. Right. They're all risky, right? And again, in the kindest way possible, he said, "Okay, but you and I both know that with respect to the customer that we're dealing with, we don't have enough leverage to secure all of the recommended revisions that you've laid out here. So what I need to understand from you is which ones really matter." And I was looking for a rock to hide under. And I contemplated, getting a clever lawyer answer out. But I realized I couldn't BS my way through this one. And so I just confessed. I had no idea is what I said in response, but I'll go find out. And I left that meeting, and I did some soul searching, and I realized I couldn't answer his question. But I had done a really good job kind of qualitatively looking at the terms. And I was confident that I had highlighted the contract terms that are universally risky. But what I couldn't tell him is in that particular deal, whether they were actually risky.
Right.
And so at that moment, I started thinking about, well, how can you quantify these terms? How can you calculate or estimate the financial impact of contract terms on a deal, which would allow you then to prioritize and answer his question? So that was kind of my eureka moment or my flux capacitor moment back in 2013. I know the exact date, so it was November 19th, 2013. It's a day that will be, firmly etched in my mind.
So where did you go then to start thinking about it?
It hit me so hard that there has to be a better way of delivering service to our client that we kind of started right away. My background was labor and employment, and so I knew at that time just enough about commercial contracting to be dangerous. But thankfully, I was surrounded by a lot of seasoned veterans, both contracts professionals and lawyers who've been doing it for 25, 30 years. They've forgotten more commercial contracting than I'll ever know. And so I just sat down with them and said, "Here's the problem. How do we solve it?" And we experimented and piloted, literally, Phil, for 4.5 years, almost 5 years.
Right.
We just rolled out the actual contract monetization tool systematically this year, a couple months back in one of our businesses. But we spent a lot of time developing the tool. We realized, Bill, that this was going to be truly transformative. A real, like I said before, a paradigm shift. And what I've learned in my time at GE is that change is hard. Big change is damn near impossible. So we knew that to effectuate this change, we would have to spend a lot of time behind the scenes developing an effective tool, and then we would showcase it. And so this year we showcased it.
So thinking about the outputs of the contract monetization tool, so you have contract clauses or language that you can essentially assign a value to in terms of their riskiness or to a particular deal, so you know where to focus on. What kind of inputs actually go into that calculation? Because it seems like a pretty complex assessment and perhaps subjective too. So I'd love to know how you actually, what was the logic that went into building it so you could have confidence in the outputs?
Yeah, sure. Well, what we've done is we have developed what we call monetization formulas. And these are term-specific monetization formulas, so you don't use the same formula for every contract term. Every contract term has its own formula that's designed to generate an estimated financial impact of that term. And then, so that's kind of the engine behind contract monetization. The fuel that goes into the engine is relevant historic data. And let me try to give you an example, and I think it'll help it make more sense. Many of our contracts, and I suspect many of your listeners in their contracts, will see what I call a liquidated damages clause. And more specifically, a clause that imposes on the vendor a penalty for late delivery, quality defects, but a penalty clause that is a discrete amount that you get penalized for if an event happens. And so we created a formula for liquidated damages, and not surprisingly, it looks at things like what site is going to be producing the part, and what has that site history been on the quality side or delivery side, as the case may be, what product is being delivered or being manufactured and delivered, and what is our history with that product in terms of on-time delivery and quality. And so you look at, the formula puts everything in deal-specific context. So you can predict with this product coming from this site, this is what you can expect in terms of financial impact. And what is fascinating about it, Phil, is, at least, for most of my career, anytime, or for the most part, when we see a liquidated damages clause in a contract, we would say, we'd throw up the red flag, a risky term. And on its face, without any additional analysis, it was scary, right? It was the boogeyman. And as we began to apply these formulas, we've realized that in some cases, it is risky. In other cases, it's just not. And so as a result, why do we fight over it? Why do we spend the customer's time, our internal client's time, fighting over stuff that doesn't matter, right? And so that should give you a little bit of an example of how they operate. And so we have those type of formulas for a large number of what we've historically called risky contract terms. And these formulas, by the way, so I should mention, Shawn Burton did not construct these formulas. This is, again, a lot of hard work, dedication, and smarts from my team, legal and contracts team, went into creating and refining and even refining again these formulas over the past 4 or 5 years.
So would you go and I don't know if back testing is possible. You look at a scenario that actually unfolded and develop the formula so that you're using data that already exists to make them more accurate, or whether you would just use trial and error. So you would actually have an engagement in place, and then perhaps something happened. You can tell where the hits and where the misses were. I'm just curious how you evolve and grow it over time in a way that still retains, ultimately your responsibility to mitigate risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the tool is only useful if the predictions, the financial impact predictions, are reliable. So you're really spot on with that question, Phil. I mean, we started to ask that question and figure out how can we go back to an existing contract that's already been negotiated, that's well into the contract, and look at the historic data, apply the formula, and see if it would have predicted the actuals that we're seeing. And so that is the next phase of this, and that will then allow us to further tweak and refine the formulas. The other thing we're doing, the legal profession, like lawyers in a company, and many other functions within a company, we're considered quote unquote backroom functions.
Yeah.
And my personal, I don't want to be in the back room. I want to figure out a way to get the legal team into the front room, right? And so what we're doing with this monetization formula is we're capturing, for every deal we do, the estimated financial benefit that comes with the recommended revisions that we've made in that deal. So let's say you have 10 contract terms, and for every contract term we go into a deal review, we'll say, this term will cost you this term will cost you this, and we have an estimated financial impact for each term in its unaltered form. And then what we do is we then say, okay, if you make these revisions, here's the positive monetary benefit that it will yield.
Yeah.
And what we started to do is just add basically add the two up and get a delta figure so that we can say, once negotiations are completed, we can say, you secured 9 of the 10 recommended revisions, and our estimate is that by doing so, those revisions will save you X dollars. And then we're going to add all those up on all deals so that we can, at the end of the year, we can monetize our value for the first time.
Yeah, it's a new value indicator.
It's kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've always, everybody that you talk to, every business that you talk to, they'll say, legal is great. My contract professionals are great. They provide an invaluable service. But my hope is, in the very near future, we can put a dollar figure on that value.
Right. No, it's fascinating, just the thought, because, well, we spend so much time negotiating, you mentioned it before, in clauses that we really don't necessarily know the impact. We just think of them as being good or bad. And if it's good language, if the language is in our favor, or if the language isn't in our favor, or if it's kind of in the middle and it's acceptable. And so we focus on trying to negotiate everything that we think the language is not in our favor or doesn't conform to what our standard T's and C's may be, for example, without really thinking what's the value of doing it. And so I'm sure, without knowing the benefits, this has got to impact your cycle times as well, I would imagine, because you're negotiating far less and focusing all your leverage just in the areas where you think you can make a difference.
Yeah, so I think my expectation, we have not yet measured it, but my expectation is that negotiation cycle times will plummet.
Yeah.
My expectation is that this tool will allow us to avoid margin erosion over the life of a contract. My expectation is that because we're going faster, that we will drive up customer satisfaction. I mean, I can't speak for your other listeners, but routinely I hear the legal team is just too hard to deal with. You're too hard to deal with on terms, and we want to change that, right? We want to protect the company's interests, but not fight over stuff that doesn't matter. I would like this tool to create a competitive advantage for GE. Yeah. Right? Think about that, Phil. I mean, when's the last time you heard the legal team created gave the business a competitive advantage.
Yeah,
you just don't typically hear that, and my hope is that this does that.
No, and we talk about that in procurement too. Our vision is obviously to be a competitive advantage for our organizations, but it's hard to actually attribute a value lever to that. What does that really mean, other than perhaps our traditional methods of tracking our performance, around cost savings, and it actually gives you something concrete to actually build it off. So something like the contract monetization tool, you said that it was an iterative process and that it took a number of years. So, I'm not going to, in 5 minutes time, get all the this is how you do it in the step-by-step guide, because it's just not possible for something of this. But I would love to know from your view of, a procurement professional who's listening, who thinks, I'd love to be able to do this across my contracts. Where do you even start? Where should they start the conversation with their legal partner to even think about mapping out something like this?
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple things I'd say in response, Bill. As a starting point, I love the tool, and I'm obviously terribly biased towards it. And so, but I'm also not naive at the same time. The tool is not yet perfect. What I like to tell people is we are continuing to perfect it. We have work to do. The formulas need further refinement. We need to automate it. Today it's presently manual. So it's not perfect. But I will tell you, and I think, I've heard my business leaders who have been exposed to it say, we are in a much better place today than we were yesterday, because we have knowledge that we didn't have yesterday. And, stating the blatantly obvious, more knowledge equals better decision making. And that's really the goal, right? It's not about making a perfect tool that with 100% accuracy predicts the financial impact of a term. The real goal is just being smarter, right? And this tool is getting there. And so it's taken us a long time. It's going to take more time. My dream is that someday we have an app on our phones. We all have an app on our phones that captures an image of a contract term, and it feeds that image or that contract term through a piece of sophisticated software that hopefully I'm involved in developing. And it spits out real time, based on historic data, the actual financial impact. And it can do it, in a matter of seconds, versus right now it's taking us, an hour meeting to come up with the numbers. So that's kind of my vision. It's going to take some time to get there. As to your question, where do they start? I would just say start. Right. Start the conversation. I believe, and again, maybe I've drank my own Kool-Aid here, but I believe that this can transform a business. I tell my folks all the time that this will be the most transformational thing you'll work on in your entire career. So, given that, despite the challenge of making it a reality, I think it's worth it. And to do it, just got to start.
So we need to just get started. A procurement professional, again, how can they approach their legal partner, or how would you recommend they, given what you know about perhaps some of the resistance they may receive, is there an approach, or is there language, or perhaps just a point of view that you think would kind of open the door to a conversation about even thinking about a tool like this, or the concept of putting a value on certain contract clauses that you would recommend?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, Phil, I have received virtually no resistance from my legal colleagues, inside and outside of GE. There is admittedly a bit of skepticism, for good reason. It's hard to fathom a world where we can actually put a dollar figure on a contract clause, particularly some of those clauses that on their face do not appear monetizable. But if you take the time to have the conversation about how it works, you explain it, you give some examples of how it works in real life, I've really never had any resistance. I've had, welcomed discussions, and since the Facebook Live event, not to open the floodgates, to a lot of calls, I have spent time with others, not necessarily sharing GE's IP, which these monetization formulas are, but kind of going into more detail about the journey and some of the steps they can take to start and progress the effort. I go back to where I started, Phil, about, what really jazzes me up is making a difference. And if I can help somebody else in another company make a difference and still, fulfill my responsibilities to GE and my family, I'll have that call. I'm happy to have that call. It's great to see. I want this to take off like wildfire.
Yeah, it's kind of the investment in the community, isn't it, and in your profession, in helping your profession become something and create value in a way that perhaps they haven't even thought about, challenging what is possible. I completely get it. So one of the questions I did have on plain language contracting was, by introducing this language, by making the contract shorter, I think you mentioned you went from like 55 pages down to 5 pages. Does that actually introduce more risk because you're not covering perhaps everything that you covered before?
Yeah, no, I get this question all the time, and it has been a historic criticism levied against plain language. But my view on this is that plain language contracting should not be confused with simplified contracting. The plain language contract that we constructed in any good plain language contract should be elegantly complex, and not complex to understand, but constructed in a way that covers all the risks in a very clear and understandable way. I don't subscribe to the notion that understandability equals more risk. I think you can have understandability and at the same time maintain the exact same risk profile. And frankly, I think plain language done right equals less risk. And just an anecdote, like I mentioned earlier, we've signed 150 contracts, and fingers crossed, we haven't had any customer disputes over the language to date. That just could be chance, but we've reduced the number of disputes that we're seeing as well, because we did spend the time, going back to the process point, we did spend the time making sure that we were protecting the company's interests, not altering the risk profile of the contract. We just made it understandable. That's really all plain language is. It's not stripping out concepts. It's not making us less safe. The idea is you're as safe or safer, but your business leaders and your customers can just actually understand it.
Yeah, and I'm imagining that you're actually taking ambiguity out of some of the contracting so that everybody has a better idea of what they're actually signing to start with, but also when you're actually looking at the ongoing management and governance, there's less confusion about certain terms because it's spelled out a little clearer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's this old saying that sorry, I wrote you a long letter, I just didn't have time to write a short one. And the same thing kind of applies here. If you spend the time, you need to spend time taking a concept and making it easy to understand, and that just takes time. And at the end of the day, it reduces word count and the risk. One of the things I'd say, Phil, is as kind of a lesson learned here. One of the big lessons I learned was not to focus on page count or word count. So I went into this initiative and told the business leaders, we're going to get down to 2 pages. Right? And I did it just to create a challenge for myself and for my team to think provocatively and push ourselves. And what I realized through this journey is it doesn't matter how long it is. Frankly, the likelihood is your contract will be shorter if you transform it into plain language. Very likely. It may be longer. But at the end of the day, what we measure at least is speed and not length. Right? That for us was kind of an epiphany midway through, and we were okay. Actually, the document started off as 5 pages, and I think we were 7.5 pages. But that's okay. It grew, and with the growth, we felt it would further reduce negotiation cycle times.
Yeah, that's not the measure. length isn't the measure of whether you've been successful or not.
Right.
The next thing I just want to talk a little bit about, because you mentioned right at the beginning, when we talked about brilliant contracting, you said that there's really two tools, and perhaps we don't have the time to do as much of a deep dive on this, but I know the other thing that you talked about was plain language contracting. I just wondered, to set the context of that, what is plain language contracting?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not a novel concept.
Right.
It's been around for quite some time. I learned about it when I was in law school way back in the day, and it was taught in law school many years before I went to law school. So it's not a novel concept. But what it is, in its simplest form, it's a drafting technique that involves packaging contracts in very easy to understand language.
Yeah.
That's really all it is, nothing more, nothing less. And when I say easy, I'm not just talking about easy for a lawyer to understand. I'm talking about easy for a non-lawyer to understand. Yeah. As we push this initiative, the way I like to talk about it is, if a high schooler can't understand the contract with no context, it's not plain enough. Go back to the drawing board. Now, obviously, I'm applying that litmus test. It's being dramatic for effect to try to push us to an uncomfortable space and push us further away from legalese.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what it is.
So if you mentioned it's been around and taught for a long time, how can we all still struggle with having essentially contracts that most of us, if we're not trained in that art or have the eye for it, don't really understand?
Yeah, it's a head scratcher.
Yeah.
Despite the intuitive appeal of plain language, it really hasn't taken off. And again, I would love to have the answer to that question. Yeah. It is truly, for me, a head scratcher.
It seems so obvious, doesn't it, of why you would do it?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny, Phil. So, I have, when we rolled out our initiative in 2014, we started our initiative for plain language contracting. A business leader that I supported, I went to him. He came to me and said, "Listen, your contracts are killing me. Mm-hmm. The customers won't even answer our calls or allow us to participate in the deal process or the RFP process because our contracts are too complicated. They can't follow them. They don't understand them.
Yeah.
And we are losing business, Shawn, because of these contracts." And again, this is 2014. I'm kind of new to this commercial contracting space, and I said, well, why don't we put it in plain language? Mm-hmm. Why don't we take the 7 contracts we have, turn it into one, take it from 55 pages or more down to something smaller, and package it in a way that people understand it? And he looked at me and said, "Well, yeah, right, exactly, duh." And he said, "Do we do that?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know if GE does it."
Right.
It's again not a novel concept. There are many advocates for plain language contracting, and then he said to me, "Well, what are we waiting for? Right? Let's get on it.
Yeah.
We should have been doing this years ago. Let's go." And so I had a strong supporter, and we launched. But it is very intuitive, Phil. Very intuitive.
And so it's essentially taking every clause and not taking away the intent of the language, but just making that language be just a lot more easily understood and perhaps less legalese. Is that essentially, I'd say, all there is to it? Obviously, there's a lot more to it. But as I think of a listener trying to conceptualize and visualize what a plain language contract may look like.
Yeah. What I would say to that question, in response to that question, Phil, is, it's a little bit more than that, and let me talk about it just for a second. I think it's really important for anybody interested in going down this path. There is in my opinion, an important process that needs to be followed to get from wherever you're at today to your final work product.
Yeah.
And you can, admittedly, take your existing contract, have your legal or contracts team, close the door, and go line by line and repackage each one in plain language. Mm-hmm. You can do it, and I'm confident that it will make the document better than it was. But for us, one of the big successes was not just the repackaging part, but it was the process we used to get there. So what we did, I have never seen a contract, and I've never been responsible for a contract where the first thing I do as a lawyer is take something out. Yeah. Right? We always put stuff in. We put our spin on it. We add this, we add that, and the contract just grows over time, right? And we don't go back and hit the pause button and say, well, wait a minute, do we really need that clause anymore? Right? Is that risk resident with this product? And if not, let's strip it out. We don't do that. And so we knew that going into this initiative. And so we started with a 2-day workout. I took a cross-functional team to Austin, Texas. And, interestingly enough, just to kick off the meeting, I had the 7 contracts. This is a big stack. It's a huge stack. And each contract was 55 pages. And as a symbolic gesture, I said, we're not drafting anything over the next 2 days. And I threw the contract literally in the garbage can. And I've never received a standing ovation in my career, but there were a couple of people who literally applauded, right? And so we spent 2 days doing 2 things. Day 1 was fully dedicated to intimately understanding the product. And in this case, it was actually a service, a software service. Understanding it intimately. I wanted to know, and I wanted my team to know, as much about the software as the software engineer who developed it. I didn't need to be a software engineer. I just needed to understand in great detail how it functioned. Day 2 was dedicated to talking with the people who developed it and the people who manage it to understand what are the operational risks associated with this service. And we created a list. Did no drafting. We ended the workout. I took that list, went home to Cincinnati, shut myself over multiple weekends in my home office, and I started from scratch. I certainly didn't look at the existing contracts. I didn't pull any sample contracts from Westlaw or Lexis. I didn't ask my colleagues for any sample clauses. I literally I went old school, opened up the laptop, pulled up the Microsoft Word document, and started from scratch. And I will tell you, it was painful. I had to unlearn a lot. It was harder to beat the lawyer out of me than I ever anticipated. But really, to do it effectively, that's what I had to do. I kind of had to retrain myself to think in kind of common sense terms and put myself in that high schooler's shoes. Do I understand this clause? If not, I rewrote it. And I rewrote every clause in that contract many times. And I ultimately produced a 5-page document that I don't know if a high schooler can understand it, but certainly my business leaders and clients could understand it.
So how did you take that experience then of doing it? Because that's a pretty intensive process for one contract. So how do you make that scalable so you can apply those same principles then to essentially anything that you're buying?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've talked to a lot of people inside and outside of lawyers inside and outside of GE, and they've asked that very question. Look, they said, Shawn, I don't have the time for that. Where do I get 2 days? Right. And then where do I get the time that you spent behind closed door? I have a life, right? I don't want to do that. And it's a fair question. My response to that question is similar to kind of the response that I had to one of your last questions about contract monetization. It's worth the investment, right? If you just look at the initiative that we did. So first plain language contract in GE Aviation was implemented in 2014. Since 2014, we've signed about 150 plain language contracts. The negotiation cycle time post-implementation of that contract is down 60%. We are spending 60% less time negotiating our contracts. Customers love it. Our sales guys and gals aren't spending a lot of time negotiating and fighting over contracts. You know what they're out doing? Selling stuff.
Closing more deals.
Right. So this initiative enables whatever growth strategy you have. It enables whatever priorities your leader or client has. And so I tell people, spend the time.
Yeah.
Spend the time.
Yeah, it's kind of increases your speed to market, for example, as well, because you're not stuck forever in a waiting to launch something because you're just spending all the time negotiating.
And going back to the competitors point, Phil, one of the things I say is, as you know, Phil, and there was a Harvard Business Review article that was came out earlier this year that kind of details the journey that we just stepped through. And I tell my folks, the sales folks, take that, get a copy, go into your customer, drop that on the table, and say, if you had any questions about whether GE puts customer first, check this out. Mm-hmm. If the legal function within GE is in the game of putting the customer first, just imagine what our other functions will do. Imagine what we'll do for you as part of this relationship. Yeah. And so I think it gives us a competitive advantage. Yeah. And again, customers love it.
Well, Shawn, I really want to thank you for spending the time with me and for sharing your experiences and the journey that you're going on at GE. For me, it was really interesting to connect for a couple of reasons. One is because you're really thinking the art of the possible. It doesn't matter whether you're in legal, whether you're in procurement, whatever function you are, that kind of transcends profession. To look at what we're doing today and think, is there a different way? And challenge kind of everything. And I love the fact that you're doing that at GE Aviation. And then the other point is obviously the two things that we talked about, I think are really relevant for procurement. And even if we're not leading the charge, we have a really strong role to play in reducing cycle times, in increasing how smart we are in terms of negotiating contracts. And what you're doing, I think, just gives us some food for thought in terms of how we can apply that to the supplier side. So the very, very last question, and this is always, and I say this at the end, it's always an easy one. If listeners would like to reach out to learn a little bit more or just to find out a little bit more about what you're doing, where would be the best place for them to go?
Find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And they call it instant message me on LinkedIn. That's I don't review it every day, but I try to review it weekly because since the Harvard Business Review activity, I've been getting a lot of requests. And so I've not turned one down. So reach out to me through that forum and we'll hook up and have a conversation.
Awesome. Well, what I'll do is I'll include the link to your LinkedIn profile and also to the Facebook Live session and the Harvard Business Review case study. I'll put those in the show notes for today's episode. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/GE contracting. That's artofprocurement.com/GE contracting, all one word. Shawn, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to invite you on the show and to hear from your experiences with GE.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you, Phil. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.